She built an empire behind glass and steel, but tonight a single dinner would test what her fortune could never buy: safety. 3 men stepped through the door like a storm with a plan. Phones went silent, laughter died, and while the city's most feared CEO waited for help that wouldn't come, the only person who stood up was a quiet father no one noticed. Why did he move like he'd been here before, and what did he know that could get them both killed? The restaurant glowed like a jewel against the night, its crystal chandeliers scattering golden light over velvet drapes and polished wood. Conversations drifted through the air, soft laughter, the delicate clink of glasses, the muted music of a piano near the bar. But in the corner, away from the warmth of company, one woman sat alone at a table set for 2. Kalina Shaw was no stranger to being watched. Her name dominated headlines, her face often graced the covers of financial magazines, her fortune a thing whispered about in boardrooms and private clubs. Tonight, dressed in understated elegance, she appeared untouchable, as though success itself had taken human form. The waiter poured her wine with practiced grace, offering the kind of deference reserved only for people who seemed larger than life. Yet behind her calm exterior lay something harder to mask. Her eyes shifted to the glass doors at the entrance, lingering on each figure that walked past. She checked her phone, letting the screen glow just long enough to catch the words before setting it face down again. Another unknown number. Another message. Another reminder that admiration and envy often shared the same skin. She lifted her glass and took a measured sip, but the taste hardly registered. What occupied her thoughts wasn't the salmon on her plate or the prestige of the room. It was the shadow she felt at her back, the certainty that power didn't buy safety, it only bought attention, and attention was dangerous. Her gaze slid across the mirrored wall, catching sight of 2 men at the bar. Their laughter was too quick, their glances too frequent. She knew the look of opportunists. She had built her empire fending off wolves dressed as allies. But this was different. This wasn't business rivalry or whispered gossip. Something about the way they leaned closer, whispering in low voices, left her unsettled. For a moment, she tried to shake the thought. Perhaps she was simply tired. Perhaps the loneliness of the corner table exaggerated everything. Yet her phone buzzed again, and the knot in her chest tightened. She didn't pick it up this time. She didn't have to. She already knew what it would say. Her fingers brushed the stem of her glass as her eyes returned to the door. The night outside stretched like a curtain, and she couldn't shake the sense that someone was waiting behind it, watching her every move, somewhere across the room. A child's laughter rang out, bright and unburdened. Kalina's eyes flicked toward the sound, landing on a modest table where a man sat with his young daughter. They looked ordinary, quiet, almost invisible to the glamour of the restaurant. The father leaned in, cutting her food, his movements patient and deliberate. He seemed at ease. Yet when he looked up, his eyes didn't wander idly like the others. He studied the room itself, the exits, the people, the small details most would miss. Kalina glanced back at her untouched meal, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had built an empire everyone wanted, but tonight, sitting alone under glittering lights, she realized enemies weren't just waiting in the boardroom. They were closer, perhaps even walking through the door at this very moment. At a table near the back, far from the polished laughter and business suits that filled the restaurant, sat a man who seemed almost invisible. He wasn't dressed in designer fabric or framed by bodyguards. His shirt was plain, his jacket worn but clean, his shoes practical. To most, he looked like just another working man sharing dinner with his child. His daughter sat across from him, legs swinging from her chair, a smile flashing each time he leaned in to help her with her plate. She wore a faded cardigan decorated with little stars, one elbow patched by his careful hand. He cut her steak into small pieces, making sure the knife never came too close to her fingers. She giggled at his quiet joke, her laughter carrying more warmth than the chandelier lights ever could. Unlike others in the room, he wasn't scrolling through a glowing screen or raising his voice to impress. He listened to her, to the hum of the restaurant, to the tiny details others dismissed as background noise. The clatter of silverware, the sharp bark of laughter at the bar, the way the hostess's smile faltered when 3 unfamiliar men stepped through the doors. His eyes caught it all, but his face betrayed nothing. He was a man who blended in by design, the kind of man people's gazes slid past without pause, quiet, reserved. The kind of quiet born not from shyness, but from discipline. Every movement seemed measured, economical, as though he never wasted energy. Even when he lifted his fork, it was with a calm certainty that made his hands seem steadier than most. To his daughter, he was simply Dad, the man who tied her shoelaces, remembered she hated onions, and always carried an extra pencil in his pocket. To everyone else, he was background, a humble father enjoying dinner on a modest budget. But beneath that quiet exterior, something sharper lived. His eyes drifted back to the door, then to the mirrored wall, then briefly to the men at the bar. His gaze was never restless, never frantic. It was the kind of gaze that assessed, measured, prepared. He noted where the servers clustered, how many exits lined the walls, how quickly the crowd would scatter if trouble began. When his daughter asked if she could draw on the paper napkin with the pen he carried, he handed it to her without hesitation, smiling as she bent over her makeshift canvas. Her world was crayons, doodles, and giggles. His world was vigilance, hidden behind the mask of an ordinary man. Most saw just a father with his little girl, nothing more. They didn't notice the posture that was too balanced, the eyes that missed nothing, or the silence that carried weight. No one guessed what he carried in that silence, and no one imagined how, before the night was over, that silence would roar louder than anything else in the room. Kalina lifted her glass again, more out of habit than thirst. The wine was rich, aged, perfectly chosen by the sommelier, but she barely tasted it. Her mind flicked restlessly between the door, the bar, and the phone she refused to check again. And then, without warning, her gaze caught on something softer. Across the room, the man at the modest table leaned close to his daughter, guiding her small hands as she tried to hold the knife and fork correctly. His voice was low, his expression patient, every movement a lesson wrapped in tenderness. She giggled when she fumbled, her shoulders shaking with unguarded joy, and he laughed too, not mocking her, but sharing the moment. It was simple, ordinary, yet it drew Kalina in like light through glass. Something stirred in her chest, a flicker from long ago. Memories of her own father teaching her how to balance a spoon at family dinners before boardrooms swallowed him whole. Back then, life had been smaller, warmer, before empires and enemies had filled her world. She blinked, surprised at the sharpness of the nostalgia. It slipped in uninvited, carving through the steel walls she had so carefully built. She shouldn't have cared. He was just a man eating with his child as countless others did every night. And yet there was something in the quiet discipline of his posture, the way he gave his daughter his complete attention, that unsettled her. She knew powerful men who couldn't stop checking their phones long enough to listen to their children speak. She knew women like herself who had traded those little dinners for strategy calls and late-night flights. And here was this stranger making the moment feel sacred. For a heartbeat, her guard lowered. She wasn't Kalina Shaw, CEO of an empire. She was simply a woman watching a father and daughter laugh over spilled juice and crooked utensils. The sound of it softened the edge of the restaurant, made her corner feel less like a fortress and more like a window into something she had lost. Their eyes never met. The man never looked her way, too focused on ensuring his daughter felt safe in the noisy room. But she studied him with quiet curiosity. Who was he? What kind of life did he lead? Invisible, yet steady. Unremarkable, yet strangely magnetic in his composure. She caught herself staring and quickly turned back to her plate, cheeks warming with a frustration she couldn't quite name. What did it matter? She would never see him again after tonight. Their worlds were miles apart, divided by money, power, and choices that could never overlap. And yet, some instinct whispered differently. This fleeting glimpse, this fragile moment of connection, was not meaningless. It was a thread waiting to be pulled. Two lives that should never have crossed were already weaving together in silence, bound by a storm neither of them could see coming. The restaurant's rhythm faltered the moment the three men walked in. They didn't fit the polished elegance of the room. Their jackets were creased, shoes scuffed, and though their shirts carried the sheen of effort, their movements betrayed something rougher beneath. They pushed the door wide as they entered, letting the chill of the night spill into the warmth inside. Conversations slowed, laughter softened, and even the pianist stumbled briefly over a note before recovering. The hostess smiled, though it was thin, uncertain. Her professional greeting fell flat when the tallest of the three ignored her completely, brushing past as though she were invisible. They didn't wait to be seated. Instead, they scanned the room with eyes that calculated rather than admired. Kalina felt it instantly. Her body stiffened, fork pausing in midair. Years of boardroom battles had taught her to sense threat before it fully announced itself. This wasn't the energy of casual diners or curious onlookers whispering her name. This was focused, deliberate, and it sent a cold ripple through her veins. She lowered her gaze, careful not to betray recognition, but her heart quickened all the same. The waitstaff noticed too. A server carrying a tray of wine glasses faltered near the bar, his eyes darting to the men as he moved aside quickly. Another adjusted the cutlery on an empty table twice over, just to avoid walking in their path. No one said anything, but the air had shifted, thick with unspoken tension. At the modest table near the back, the single dad noticed as well. His daughter remained blissfully unaware, still sketching shapes onto the napkin with her pen, humming softly as she worked. But her father's eyes lifted, calm and deliberate. He didn't stare, didn't stiffen, didn't betray alarm. He simply observed. One glance at the men, another at the exits, then back to his daughter, his hand resting steady on the table as though nothing had changed. It was the kind of watchfulness born not from paranoia, but from instinct. Kalina's fingers brushed the edge of her phone where it lay face down. She thought of the messages she had ignored earlier, the warnings cloaked in taunts. "You're not untouchable." A shiver slid across her shoulders. She lifted her glass, more to steady her hand than to drink, and pretended to study the wine. But her eyes followed the men in the mirrored reflection beside her. They didn't sit. Not yet. They loitered near the bar, speaking in low tones, their shoulders leaning together. One of them laughed under his breath, though nothing about it carried humor. The tallest kept glancing toward her corner table, each look shorter, sharper, more certain. The restaurant grew quieter, as if everyone knew trouble had just walked in. And though no one spoke it aloud, unease had settled like a shadow across the room. Kalina forced herself to breathe evenly, but inside a single truth pulsed louder than the music. Something was coming, and when it broke, it would not stay contained within crystal glasses and linen-draped tables. The moment arrived with terrifying precision. One by one, the three men peeled away from the bar, their footsteps heavy against the polished floor. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Each stride carried the quiet confidence of predators who already believed their prey had nowhere to run. Kalina felt them before she saw them. A shadow passed across her table, blocking the golden light of the chandelier above. She looked up, her practiced mask of authority slipping into place. But it wavered the instant she met their eyes. There was no respect there, no hesitation. Only purpose, Miss Shaw, the tallest one drawled, his voice low enough that only nearby tables could hear. You'll come with us. Quietly, her pulse spiked. For years, she had walked into hostile negotiations, faced men who wanted to see her broken. But this wasn't a boardroom. There were no contracts to renegotiate, no lawyers to call. Here, her empire, her money, her power meant nothing. She was just a woman sitting alone at dinner, and they had come not for her fortune, but for her life. The second man leaned closer, the sour scent of alcohol clinging to his words. Don't make a scene. No one here can help you. Around them, the restaurant froze. Diners who had been laughing moments ago now sat rigid, eyes wide, forks suspended in midair. A woman at a nearby table clutched her husband's arm, whispering something urgent, but he shook his head sharply, pulling her back into her seat. Across the room, a few slipped quietly toward the exit, heads down, desperate not to be noticed. The rest remained, paralyzed in suffocating silence. Kalina tried to rise, but the third man stepped into her path, hand pressed casually against her shoulder, forcing her back into the chair. The gesture wasn't rough, but the implication was brutal. She was trapped, her mask cracked. For the first time in years, the steel in her eyes flickered. Beneath the hard lines of her face, something fragile showed. Fear, raw and unhidden. She had built an empire brick by brick, each decision calculated to project invincibility. But now the illusion shattered. In this room of strangers, she wasn't a titan of industry. She was simply a woman about to be taken. Let's not make this harder, the tall one hissed, his fingers brushing the edge of her armrest like a warning. You walk out now or we carry you. Either way, you're coming. Kalina's breath caught in her throat. She glanced around, desperate, but no one moved. Not the waiters, not the diners, not the couple who had been whispering in the corner. The entire room held its breath, waiting for someone else to act. Her phone buzzed again against the table, the vibration a cruel reminder of warnings unheeded. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the weight of three men loomed over her like walls closing in. The silence deepened, thick and unbearable. The question pulsed in every heart in that room. Who would act? For a moment, it seemed the entire restaurant had surrendered to fear. Three men towered over Kalina, the weight of their presence pressing her into silence. The waitstaff stayed frozen in place, diners clung to their seats, and no one dared to break the tension. Then quietly, a chair scraped against the floor. At the back table, the single father leaned toward his daughter. His voice was soft, steady, a whisper meant only for her. Stay here, sweetheart. Don't move. Her wide eyes blinked up at him, confusion flickering across her small face. But something in his tone, calm, unshakable, made her obey. She clutched her pen tight in her hand and nodded. The man straightened. He didn't rush, didn't bluster. He simply rose, rolling his shoulders once as if loosening a stiffness, then stepped into the open. For an instant the diners thought he was making a mistake. A father, an ordinary man walking toward three predators armed with menace. A murmur rippled through the room, sympathy, disbelief, even pity. But then they saw his eyes. There was no panic there, no hesitation. His gaze was level, sharp, unwavering, like a man who had already measured the room and made peace with what had to be done. His movements carried a quiet certainty, each step deliberate, balanced, as if every muscle remembered a rhythm most people never learned. The tallest of the intruders sneered when he noticed him. Sit back down, old man. This isn't your business. The father said nothing. He moved closer, positioning himself between Kalina and the men with the precision of someone setting pieces on a board. His stance was unassuming, almost casual, yet his weight rested perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet. Kalina's breath hitched. She recognized control when she saw it. The second man lunged, grabbing for his collar. In the blink of an eye, the father shifted. A twist of the wrist, a pivot of the hip, simple, fluid, devastating. The attacker stumbled forward, arm wrenched into a lock that ended with a dull thud against the table's edge. A gasp erupted from the room. The third man drew back, fists clenched, but before he could swing, the father's hand shot out, striking with surgical precision at his forearm. The knife he hadn't shown yet clattered harmlessly to the ground, spinning across the polished floor. The room went silent, except for the ragged breathing of the men who had thought themselves wolves. Diners stared, wide-eyed, the illusion of ordinary father dissolving before them. In his place stood someone different, someone trained, someone who carried storms behind calm eyes. He shielded Kalina without a word, his frame solid between her and danger. He didn't posture or threaten. He simply existed in that space as immovable as stone, and in that silence, every witness understood. This man was no stranger to violence. He moved with the certainty of someone who'd been here before. The restaurant still trembled with aftershocks of violence. Chairs overturned, glasses shattered across the floor, napkins stained with spilled wine and fear. Diners huddled near the walls, whispering in disbelief, their eyes darting between the retreating figures of the intruders and the man who had stood so calmly against them. The three men, rattled by the unexpected resistance, didn't linger. One clutched his arm, another hissed curses under his breath as they stumbled toward the exit. By the time flashing blue and red lights painted the windows, they had vanished into the night, leaving behind only wreckage and terror. Police officers rushed inside, their radios crackling, voices clipped and urgent. They scanned the room, weapons ready, but it was already too late. The danger had come and gone in less time than it took for them to arrive. Kalina sat motionless at her table, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Her hand still clutched the edge of the linen cloth, knuckles white, as if letting go might send her tumbling into panic. She had faced crises before, storms in boardrooms where billions were at stake. Yet never had she felt this powerless, this fragile. Her gaze shifted slowly to the man standing a few steps away. He wasn't grandstanding or soaking in the awe of the crowd. Instead, he bent down to his daughter, brushing a curl of hair from her face and speaking to her with the same calm tone he had used before chaos erupted. She nodded, tucking her pen back into her backpack as though nothing extraordinary had just unfolded. Kalina swallowed hard. Of all the things that had shaken her tonight, it wasn't the knives or the threats. It was him, his control, his silence, the way he had moved with absolute certainty, shielding her without hesitation, then returning to anonymity as though it had cost him nothing. She rose unsteadily, her heels clicking against the broken glass as she crossed the distance between them. The other diners parted to make way, their eyes following her, still buzzing with whispers. She stopped just before him, searching his face. He met her gaze briefly, brown eyes steady. "Unreadable, thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying more weight than the simple words deserved. He gave a small nod, not dismissive but not inviting either, then turned back to his daughter. That was all. No heroic speech, no demand for recognition. Just a nod and silence. Kalina felt her throat tighten. Gratitude tangled with curiosity, with the unsettling realization that she owed her life to a man she knew nothing about. Who was he? A father? A stranger? A protector who disappeared behind quiet eyes? As the police moved through the restaurant, taking statements, comforting patrons, Kalina stood rooted in place, unable to shake the question clawing at her chest. Why had he risked himself for her? And why did she feel that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross? Long after the police had finished their questions and the shaken patrons had drifted into the night, the quiet man remained a mystery. He offered only the barest details to the officers, his name, his statement, nothing more. They pressed, curious about the way he had moved, the training written in every precise motion. But his answers were clipped, respectful, the kind of responses that closed doors instead of opening them. Kalina lingered nearby, pretending to study the chaos of the restaurant, though her focus never strayed far from him. She wanted to ask, needed to ask, but his silence was a wall she could not climb. Later, when the lights dimmed and the last tables were cleared, he walked his daughter home under the pale glow of street lamps. She chattered softly, recounting her drawing, the spilled juice, as if none of the danger had touched her. He listened, with a smile, nodding at the right moments, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Yet behind his calm eyes memories stirred. Once, long before quiet nights with crayons and homework, he had worn a different life, a soldier's life. The kind that measured days not by laughter, but by survival. He had moved through deserts and cities where shadows hid enemies, where every decision could mean life or death. His hands, the same hands that now tied shoelaces and packed school lunches, had once carried weapons, carried brothers through fire, carried the weight of orders he could never forget. But tragedy had severed that world from this one. A mission gone wrong, a life lost he could never bring back. The details were etched into him like scars invisible to the eye. When he buried his past, he also buried the man he once was. For his daughter's sake, he walked away. He traded uniforms for flannel shirts, battlefields for bedtime stories. He had sworn never to fight again, and, for years, he kept that vow, until tonight. The men had left him no choice. He hadn't risen because he wanted to be a hero. He had risen because danger had threatened the fragile world he'd built for his child, the world he'd promised to protect. His silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. His calm wasn't ignorance, it was discipline honed over years. As he tucked his daughter into bed later that night, smoothing her hair and whispering a promise that she was safe, his chest ached with the weight of it all. He knew this peace came at a price. Every time his past broke through the walls he had built, it risked dragging him back into a world he had tried to leave behind. Kalina, somewhere across the city, replayed the moment in her mind, the way he had moved, the steadiness of his gaze. To her, it was a revelation. To him, it was a wound reopening. He had sworn never to fight again. But tonight, his past had forced his hand. The boardrooms she once commanded with ease now felt like traps. Every polished handshake, every polite smile carried an undertone she couldn't ignore. The attack at the restaurant hadn't been random. Kalina knew it in her bones. Men like that didn't simply wander into fine dining halls on a whim. They had come for her, and someone had sent them. The thought turned her stomach. She had built her empire brick by brick, but enemies had multiplied in the shadows just as quickly. Competitors whispered about her downfall, rivals studied her every weakness, and board members who had once praised her now seemed to linger too long on questions of stability. The attack had been a message: you are not untouchable. Since that night, paranoia crept into her every moment. Crossing the street, she caught strangers glancing twice. In the elevator, she felt eyes tracking her reflection in the mirrored walls. At her office, a car parked too long outside sent her pulse racing. She told herself it was nothing, just the echo of fear, but the memory of those men, their certainty, would not fade. Her phone buzzed constantly now, not just with corporate updates, but with unknown numbers, blocked calls and cryptic texts. You can't hide forever.
Next time, no one will save you.
She deleted them, but the words sank deep. For the first time, all her power, All the billions, the influence, the lawyers and security details felt paper-thin. And in that void, her thoughts circled back to him, the quiet father, the man who had risen when no one else had moved, the stranger who had faced down danger with the steadiness of stone. He hadn't been armed with wealth, with guards, with reputation. Yet he had done what her empire could not: shield her. She remembered the way he'd stood between her and the men, shoulders squared, calm as if he'd rehearsed that moment 100 times before. She remembered his silence, the way he'd nodded at her gratitude, as though saving her life was an inconvenience rather than a triumph.
Most men she knew would have boasted, demanded recognition.
He had simply returned to his daughter as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Now, as she sat alone in her penthouse, the city sprawling beyond her windows, she couldn't shake the question. Who was he? And why had he risked everything for a stranger? Her empire had always been her shield, but that shield was cracking. She needed answers. She needed someone who wouldn't run when trouble came again. Dinner, she realized, had only been the beginning. The real hunt had only started, and whoever wanted her silenced wasn't finished yet. Kalina didn't like asking for help. Her whole career had been built on refusing to depend on anyone. But that night had changed the rules. The men who wanted her gone weren't going to stop, and the thought of living every day with that shadow creeping closer left her restless, even afraid. There was only one face that came to mind when she thought of protection. Not her hired security, not her advisors. Him. The quiet father. She found him days later, not in a marble office or behind tinted glass, but in an ordinary neighborhood. He was walking his daughter home from school, her backpack bouncing as she told a story with all the dramatic flair of childhood. He listened intently, smiling as though the rest of the world didn't exist. It was such a simple, ordinary scene that Kalina almost turned away, feeling the weight of her intrusion, but she stepped forward. "I need your help." He turned, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in hostility but in caution. He shifted his daughter gently behind him, a reflex he didn't seem aware of. "I'm not for hire," he said quietly. "It's not about money," she answered quickly. "It's about survival." He studied her for a long moment. In his gaze, she saw recognition, the memory of that night, the chaos, the way he had stood between her and danger. And then he shook his head. "That life is behind me. I won't drag my daughter back into it." The refusal hit harder than she expected. She wanted to argue, to insist, but she saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't lying. He had walked away from something violent, something costly, and every instinct in him screamed not to return. She left with a hollow ache in her chest, more uncertain than ever. That evening he found his daughter at the kitchen table, crayons scattered across the surface. She was drawing, 3 large figures looming over a smaller woman, and beside her a tall man standing strong. Above their heads she had scribbled shaky stars, as if marking the moment with light. He froze, watching her small hands sketch the scene. "That's you, Daddy," she said proudly, pointing to the man who stood against the others. "You made everyone safe." Her words sank deep, stirring something he had tried to bury. He had promised himself never to fight again, never to step back into the darkness that had once swallowed his life. But innocence had been threatened, not just hers, but a room full of people too paralyzed to act. Walking away now felt like surrender, and surrender wasn't something he could teach his daughter. The next morning he sought Kalina out. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He spoke simply, firmly. "I'm not your bodyguard, but I won't let violence win." It wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about doing what was right. For once, he couldn't walk away. The second attempt came without the cover of crowded rooms or glittering chandeliers. No diners to gasp, no piano music to mask the silence. This time, they wanted her alone. Kalina had been warned to expect it. Cryptic texts, sudden gaps in her schedule, meetings that felt like bait. She tried to dismiss the paranoia, but it followed her like a shadow. And when the message arrived, summoning her to a late-night emergency meeting in a quiet office across town, her instincts screamed trap. She wasn't alone. The quiet father was there, his daughter safe at home, his expression calm but unyielding. He had agreed reluctantly to stand at her side, but now his focus sharpened with the precision of a man who had been here before. "They'll want control, not chaos," he told her. "That means they'll make mistakes." The building was dark when they arrived, the lobby echoing with hollow emptiness.
Too empty.
Every detail felt staged, the lights buzzing faintly, the receptionist desk abandoned, the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. Kalina's throat tightened. She had walked into boardroom traps before, but never like this. They didn't wait long. The three men emerged from the shadows, joined now by others, their movements calculated. This time there was no pretending. Their eyes burned with intent, their voices sharp with command. "End of the line, Shaw. No empire, no deals. You're coming with us." Kalina froze, the old instinct to fight back with words rising in her chest. But the father stepped forward first, his voice low and steady. "You're not here for her," he said. "You're here for what she represents. Power, leverage, that's why you failed the first time." The tallest man sneered, circling. "And what are you? Some hired muscle? You'll fall like the rest." But this wasn't the same quiet man they had underestimated before. Tonight he wasn't just standing in defense. He had been watching, planning. He had memorized their tells, the limp of one, the impatience of another, the way their leader barked orders before thinking them through. When the first man lunged, he was ready. A sidestep, a grip, and the attacker slammed into the wall, winded. Another came from behind, only to find his wrist caught, his momentum turned against him in a single fluid twist. Each move was efficient, precise, less a fight, more a dismantling. But it wasn't just about force. In the chaos, truths spilled. The men weren't freelancers. They were connected to someone inside her world. A rival she had trusted, someone who had smiled across polished tables while plotting her downfall. The betrayal cut deeper than the knives they carried. Kalina's eyes burned with fury as the scheme unraveled. She had spent years building walls only to be undermined from within. Yet beside her, the father never faltered. He pressed forward, dismantling their plan piece by piece until the trap collapsed under its own weight. When the last man fell silent, groaning on the floor, the room echoed with stillness. Kalina exhaled, shaking but steadied by the presence at her side. When they came again, they hadn't found an easy target. They had found their reckoning. The city felt different when the storm had passed. For days, Kalina had lived in the grip of fear, her every step shadowed by whispers and threats. Now, standing at her office window, she saw the skyline not as towers of power, but as fragile shapes against the morning light. Her empire, once everything, seemed smaller in comparison to what she had nearly lost. She thought of the men who had come for her, of betrayal that had cut deep, and of the stranger who had stood between her and the darkness. Her gratitude pressed against her ribs like a weight she could no longer ignore. This time, when she found him, she didn't come as a CEO. She came simply as a woman who had been saved.
"Thank you," she said again, her voice breaking where it hadn't before. "Not just for that night, not just for me."
For showing me that strength isn't always what we think it is." He met her gaze with the same calm steadiness, then shook his head lightly.
"I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because someone had to. There was no pride in his voice, no claim to heroism.
Just truth. That humility unsettled her more than all the chaos had. For years, she had surrounded herself with people desperate for recognition, for status, for power. He wanted none of it. And perhaps that was why he was the only one she could trust. But he did not linger in her world of steel and glass. He returned to his daughter, to the simple rhythm of evenings filled with crayons and bedtime stories. She greeted him with open arms, not because he had fought, not because he had saved anyone important, but because he was Dad. To her, he wasn't a warrior or a protector from the past. He was the man who remembered to cut the crusts off her sandwich, who listened to her stories even when they went in circles, who made her laugh when she felt small. Kalina watched them from a distance once,
Unseen, and felt a strange warmth she couldn't explain.
She realized the real strength she had witnessed wasn't just in his fists or his calm in chaos. It was in the way he loved, the way he chose his daughter's safety above all else, the way he kept his promises quietly but fiercely. Her empire would rebuild. The betrayals would be handled. But the lesson lingered. Power wasn't towers of glass or headlines in the press. True power was knowing what and who you would stand for, even when the world turned against you. As the sun dipped low, the father tucked his daughter into bed, whispering the same words he had promised her on that first night. "You're safe. I'm here." In the end, his greatest victory wasn't saving a CEO, it was keeping a promise to his daughter.